All right. So here we are. This is objective 11. You may have been asking yourself where are the civil rights and all this, and the reason is civil rights is an objective all by itself. Now, an important note to remember here is civil rights also encompasses um, human rights and things of that nature. So here we go. Objective 11.1 is how the military led to the modern civil rights movement. We've already discussed how the systematic rights were taken away from the African Americans following the Civil War, and it seemed like everything was going good until we have the Great Depression, and the Great Depression kind of set things on the backtrack. Then in World War II, this group right here on the right, the Tuskegee Airmen, are going to be highly important in the modern movement. So first, World War One. In World War One, there was a group known as the Harlem Hellfighters, and a very interesting story. And I showed you the video in class. They're given to the French. They're not allowed to march in the victory parade in Paris. And the story of Henry Johnson should be a movie. I mean, the man, and I think I showed you this video. If not, I'll show you at this point. But Henry Johnson's life definitely should be a story of bravery and courage, yet at the same time, kind of the despair and maybe talking about not meeting the needs of our veterans is highly important. And why it's not a movie. I mean, we make dumb movies all the time. We made a movie about a boat sinking, Titanic. But anyway, now World War II. Now World War I, they're still fighting in segregated units under white commanders. Now World War II, we have the first African American general, and things begin to change here. So we do have the Tuskegee Airmen. These were brave fighters, well known for their courage as well as their brotherhood. It was said they never lost a man. We have Benjamin O. Davis. He's here on the right. He's the first African American general, which is a big deal. And Dory Miller, who we discussed in World War II, was a hero of Pearl Harbor. Just interesting story. Following World War II, the exploits or the stories of the Tuskegee Airmen are getting huge. And so President Harry Truman makes a decision to have a civil rights commission. And I know this is a dumb moment, but he wants to know, are civil rights being met? Come back and they say, no, they're not. Now, with Executive Order 9981, Truman famously desegregated the military, which was a big deal. And so a lot of people have actually said the movement for social justice started in the Army with that whole mentality. Now, in 1947, as well, we have the Jackie Robinson story, first African-American baseball player. If you have not seen the movie 42 about his life, please watch it. It's very interesting. And some things have been dramatized naturally, but holds true, and it's an impactful story of a man who knew that he could beat the odds if simply given a chance. Now, Objective 11.2, the federal government is going to get involved in the modern civil rights movement. For the longest time, the federal government said, hey, this is a state right, you figure out what you need to do. Now, all of that changes, and we move into this. So, in 1948, there is a white backlash. Truman decides he's going to move for the civil rights, and a branch of the Democratic Party breaks off. They call themselves the Southern Democrats or Dixiecrats. The major platform was protection of states' rights. The guy here on the side here, Senator Strom Thurmond. 1954, Brown versus the board said school segregation was unconstitutional, however, did not put things in place to integrate the schools. Following this decision, Senator Thurmond and others will sign the Southern Manifesto, which urged Southern states to resist forced integration. At this point, groups who we've talked about before, the KKK and also the White Citizens Councils, to help achieve the Southern Manifesto. So we definitely have an issue here in that the federal government has said you must integrate, but along those same lines, they're not willing to step in. And so we're going to force an incident. An incident has to happen, and we have to see how the federal government responds. So the battle lines are drawn here. The NAACP and Thurgood Marshall, who actually argued the Brown versus the Board case, and we'll look at that, is going to help 9 African-American students enroll at Central High School in Little Rock. Now, Governor Faubus, he's right here, second from the right, famously said, I'm not being forced to integrate the school, and he actually ordered the Arkansas National Guard to block the high school. So he's essentially using his powers as the governor to not listen to a federal government. Now, we must remember Ike as a general. Eisenhower's not big on civil rights. However, Eisenhower's also a man of order, and if we tell you to do something, you need to do it. So when they're not responding in the correct way, he's going to act. Now, in 1957, there at Central Little Rock 9, the riots are going to grow bigger. The mayor of Little Rock actually wrote President Eisenhower about the situation. And so Ike decides he's going to send the 101st Airborne Unit to, number one, they will dismiss the National Guard. And this goes back to federal versus state, father versus son. If the federal government army is there, the militia, the state militia, the National Guard must back down. Number two, integrate the high school. Following this, we have two minor civil rights acts. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 said that there's a civil rights branch of justice, and there are court injunctions could not be used for stopping voting. Then in 1960, there were some loopholes in this previous act, and this was basically made to fix those loopholes. Now, we do not have the big civil rights bill we want. We'll get there. Now, in Kennedy's term, in 1963, the 24th Amendment abolishes the poll taxes, and this is where Dr. King is going to make one of his biggest marches, and that's in Birmingham. Now, we call this the Children's Crusade because children are actually going to get involved, and the TV crews caught some of the most vile activities of the Civil Rights era. This included jailing children, the use of fire hoses and dogs, under the direction of Bull Connor, who's the Public Safety Commissioner. Robert Kennedy is brought into this attention, and then JFK. JFK goes and announces the Civil Rights Bill of 1963. This was his vision of a fully non-segregated society. The Southern senators famously will filibuster this, which means they talked it to death. Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed after JFK's death, and this is going to end Jim Crow laws in public places. At this point, we're going to focus on political equality. All right? So the first thing, we have the idea of disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement means to keep someone from voting, and these are the things that are going to go through. At this point, we only have one method left. The grandfather clause is off the table. We've already talked about the poll taxes being taken away. The last one is the literacy test. So Dr. King planned a march in Selma, Alabama in 1965. The sheriff of Selma, Jim Clark, warns that if the marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they would be beaten, essentially. This does not impede them. They go and line up, and TV crews capture the violence. And you can see there in the top left the tear gases. The president at this time, President Johnson, sees this and will sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which actually said you could not use a literacy test. So political equality has been achieved, as well as social equality. Now that leaves one bit of equality left, and that is economics. All right? Now, objective 11.1 are key groups, events, and individuals, and there's a lot here, so I'm going to get through them. So our nonviolent groups, NAACP, they use the courts and laws to prove discrimination wrong. Second group is going to be called CORE, or Congress of Racial Equality. Started during World War II, James Farmer is going to try to get different nationalities to work together. In the 50s, we have the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association. This is when the boycott of the buses happens at Rosa Parks, also the first appearance of Dr. King and a group he's under. The SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference, this is Dr. King's group to combine all the improvement associations, and their preferred thing were marches, big marches. We have SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We're moving into the 60s here. College students that wanted to participate in the movement, and they had a very effective tactic called a sit-in. Lastly, we have COFO, which is the Council of Federated Organizations, and it's a combination of NAACP, CORE, and SCLC to focus on voting rights in the South. There's two really big things they're involved with, most notably is Freedom Summer there. Now, some key events here. In 1961, we have the Freedom Riders. They're going to test out new immigration laws NAACP had achieved. Famously, they will bomb one of the buses there. We have 1962, the Ole Miss riots, and we'll cover that in class, but James Meredith was barred from entering Ole Miss. There was riots going on, and JFK responded much in the same vein as Eisenhower by sending federal troops to enforce the law. 1963 is Freedom Summer. It's a voter registration project by COFO. We actually have 3 workers. They're down here who are killed. And in fact, I think it is going to be Ghosts of Mississippi or Mississippi Burning. One of the 2 movies is about this trial, which is a horrible trial that the people basically admitted it and got away with it. 1964, we have the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a party that is organized to get African Americans. Fannie Lou Hamer, they're the first ones to go to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and they want to be seated on the floor and cast their vote for who they think should be president. Some key events there for that. Now, for James Meredith, here he is. In 1962, he tries to enroll at Ole Miss. Governor Barnett was in Jackson at a football game. He actually incited a riot at the campus. During this, the Department of Justice head guy, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, is made aware. He calls out the federal marshals to stop anything from happening. One of the marshals is killed. There are some telephone conversations, which we'll talk in class, between JFK and Barnett, and they try to solve things. Ultimately, it doesn't work. It seems like Barnett is stalling, and we come down to the same issue that we've had time and time again, federal government or state government. JFK sends out the Army to put Oxford on martial law and get Meredith into school. A similar event, you can see the picture down here on the bottom right. 1963, Governor George Wallace will block the door at the University of Alabama. And I do that to show you that, yes, the Ole Miss one is the famous one. But there were several incidents of this happening in many schools across the South. Now, some inspirations and some martyrs of this, okay? Emmett Till, his death motivated the leaders to change. And I'll show you that video there of why his mother wanted this picture of her son's basically rotting corpse and what that's going to do. Now, Rosa Parks, her arrest kickstarts civic engagement. That means people wanting to get involved. And she famously said, "It was Emmett Till's face I saw." Dr. King, his spirit moved the movement, civil disobedience, and he used direct confrontational methods to take it to the fight, but kill him with kindness type mentality. Medgar Evers is another person who is going to be shot and killed in Jackson, Mississippi, by a white supremacist named Byron De La Beckwith. And again, that's either Ghosts of Mississippi or Mississippi Burning. I'll figure out which one in a minute. His death got a discussion about corruption in the courts because this was basically a wolf whistle, or not necessarily a wolf whistle, but a wolf jury, meaning they can hear what they want to hear. And then we have Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall, big in the civil rights, defeated school segregation, he integrated Little Rock, first black Supreme Court justice, and there is a movie made about him called simply Marshall. Not We Are Marshall. That's about the Marshall thundering herd and the incident with football. Marshall is about Thurgood. All right, objective 11.4 is the emergence of a Black Power movement. Here you have one of the voices of that, Black and Proud James Brown, the godfather of soul. If you ain't got no James Brown in your life, you need to go experience some James Brown music. It's very, very good. Anyway, now in Greenville, Mississippi, 1966, the man on the right here, Stokely Carmichael, is the leader of SNCC, the nonviolent, and he's made aware of some situation, and he says, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." And he is actually the one who gives us the phrase Black Power. What he meant by it was to be proud of yourself and to never settle for second best. However, along with Black Power, there is a rise of militant means to achieve civil rights, meaning don't take things lying down anymore if they're going to, whatever, be willing to defend yourself. Now, one of the first groups we have is the Nation of Islam. In the 1930s, the Nation of Islam has started to promote Black pride and separatism. They did not want to be part of general society. In the 1960s, they will split with the civil rights movement. No more turn the other cheek. Elijah Muhammad, he's the one on the left, was the prophet, and Malcolm X becomes the most outspoken proponent or person supporting this group. Their main goal is to separate society, they want a separate society, rather, controlled entirely by blacks. They also believed in things like black rifle clubs, the use of the Second Amendment, etc. Nothing really that we haven't heard before. Our next group here are the Black Panther Party. Now, this is formed out of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party by 3 men, Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, and Bobby Seale in California in 1966. They wanted a separate society, much like the Nation of Islam, but they also agreed with the Communist Party. This is going to get the FBI on the tail of this group, and there's a lot of different things. There's a shooting, and Huey Newton's accused of that, and he goes to jail, and there's all kinds of things. They are a militant group, and they would be aggressive to make a point. Again, I use the word militant and not violent. They didn't go just start shooting willy-nilly. They were militant. They were very aggressive in their talk. They were not passive. And if you threatened them, they would let you know, hey, you mess with me, you're going to have to deal with the consequences. All right. Objective 11.5 deal with some key speeches by Dr. King and some things about them. The first one is the letter from Birmingham jail and the background. So in 1963, the Children's Campaign, Dr. King is going to march in what he called the most segregated city in America. He's arrested for inciting riots and he goes to jail. Okay. While in jail, he writes on the scraps, I think it was of toilet paper. They wouldn't give him any paper. Many critics are criticizing his direct confrontational methods. He writes the letter from Birmingham jail for two goals. Number one, he wants to explain to the clergy or Christian pastors that direct confrontation is not bad. He uses the analogy here of a boil or a wart that must be exposed to air to make people aware about it in order to heal. The second thing is to force the public to make a decision. Most people during this were actually bystanders. They weren't white supremacists. They weren't in the movement. And he says here, you're either with us or against us. Dr. King said they must choose. And a massive idea there. Now, remember, most of the groups in the civil rights saved, the militant groups were interracial. Now, the next really big speech is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So how do we get to this point? After Birmingham, Robert Kennedy, then Attorney General, asked his brother, President JFK, to help in the civil rights movement. The 1963 bill is killed by a filibuster talking to death by Southern senators, and so a march is planned off an earlier march designed by A. Philip Randolph in the 40s that got the attention of FDR. And so here's the program you can see here. It's actually really, really interesting. You've got Miss Medgar Evers, and this is kind of a tribute to her late husband at this point. A. Philip Randolph is talking, John Lewis, who's a senator right now, James Farmer of CORE, and so on and so forth. And if you look all the way down here to the last person speaking, it is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was put last. No one wanted to go last. Now, I have a dream speech. As I said, Dr. King last to speak. He is actually asked by someone in the crowd, the name escapes me, to, quote, tell them about the dream he had shared. And so he went off his prepared speech and told them about I Have a Dream. This becomes the rallying cry for the civil rights movement. It inspires countless others to join or help in the movement, and it's been ranked as one of the 50 best speeches in U.S. history. So, very, very good stuff there. All right. Objective 11.6 are accomplishments and achievements of the civil rights movement. So the first is social equality. Jim Crow laws and separate but equal was not equal for society. So we do have the end of school segregation, Brown versus the Board. We have the end of college requirements with James Meredith, end of separate but equal, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the end of segregation in housing, Civil Rights Act of 1968. So socially, they're pretty much inclined to be together. Political equality. We have the end of gerrymandering, which gerrymandering is the idea that you would align the districts to where smaller districts would not have as much pull. Baker versus Carr did away with that. We have the end of poll taxes in the 24th Amendment, and the end of literacy tests with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, the fight for economic equality is the big deal here. So, in 1967, Dr. King starts something called the Chicago Campaign. After his death, it will be changed to the Poor People's Campaign. This is why he came to Memphis in 1968, was for this economic equality. He was here for a garbage strike. We have two riots. First is the Watts riot in 1965, and that's the picture here. This is immediately after Selma and the Voting Rights Act, but there's another riot, the Detroit riot, 1967. The Kerner Commission has come out, appointed by the president, and famously they said America has created two societies, one white and one black. And that's a scary thought there. And then we also have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You hear this all the time when you go to get a job. So and so is a member of the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. It basically says there. Now, we have not reached full economic equality, and in class we'll talk about this, like why these things are still occurring. Now, to kind of counteract some of these things in economic equality, they go back to education. They say people don't have enough education. So a plan is put in place, and we call it affirmative action. It's a very controversial program. So affirmative action's goal is to get minorities opportunities that had been denied them previously of race. And so you can see here, in 2002, you can see the net worth by race and ethnicity, and there's a massive gap there, okay? And the question is, we want other ethnicities to get into the higher brackets, we'll say. Now, the first thing they said is quotas. They said, fine, they want to get them in college. Out of 100 people, we're going to make, let's say, 20 spots for Hispanics. We're going to make 45 spots for African Americans, and the rest to whites. That is called a quota. There's a very famous court case called Backey versus the Board of Regents of California, which says you can't use that. People have called affirmative action reverse discrimination. The major thing of affirmative action, and it will come up with everyone when you go to college, it can play a part in the decision, but it cannot be the only part of the decision. In other words, they can't let you into school because of your race. They can give you scholarship money because you had a significantly less fortunate background than others. But that's affirmative action, and we'll debate that. Now, the last slide here are the first. And we have the first, okay? So our first black mayor is Marion Barry, Washington, D.C. First black governor is Douglas Wilder in Virginia. The first black UN ambassador is Andrew Young. He was actually there when Dr. King was shot. Interesting things there. The first black attorney general is Eric Holder. He's big because he famously, it's the first time that a country sues an oil producer. In this case, it was BP after Deepwater Horizon. The first black president is Barack Obama. However, the first black man to run for president was in the 80s, and it was Jesse Jackson. So there we are with that. Now in class, we'll cover over some other things.